a teenage date night that ended in a brutal execution. January 1956, Great Falls, Montana. Winter here felt like a suffocating living beast. Sub-zero temperatures fractured the frozen dirt and mutated the rushing waters into sheets of creeping, pitch-black ice. It forced families to hunker down, lock their doors, and keep their mouths shut. Roughly 40,000 residents sat trapped between the freezing Missouri River and a desolate, never-ending expanse of prairie. Total strangers didn't exist here. A local kid walking into a diner would get a knowing nod from the grill cook before sliding into a booth. Gossip dragged on at a glacial pace, while everyday life practically stood completely still. Yet beneath this peaceful illusion, a sinister current was brewing. 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle definitely wasn't a local boy. Hailing from Waco, Texas, he traded a hot, bustling hometown for 1,000 miles of icy, dead isolation. Months prior, he deployed to Malmstrom Air Force Base, joining the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. He still possessed that naive arrogance of youth, convinced he had the entire universe figured out. Folks naturally gravitated toward the charming airman, not because he was obnoxious, but because he radiated an effortless magnetism that drew strangers in. The guy lived for upbeat records and tearing up the dance floor. After bumping into Patricia Kitsky in December 1955, she became his absolute obsession. Friends called her Patty. She was a 16-year-old high school junior, full of teenage innocence. Whip-smart and incredibly popular, she genuinely cared about her peers and flashed a truly authentic smile. Her parents owned a house on the southwest side, nestled in a cramped but pristine suburban grid. She felt utterly secure, deeply anchored in a town the newly relocated Texan barely understood. Yet whenever their paths collided, sparks flew. Friends claimed they were destined soulmates. It wasn't toxic control. It was a profound, undeniable connection they both recognized immediately. Lloyd fell head over heels instantly. Within weeks of dating, rumors circulated about an impending wedding. Blindly optimistic, they were practically glowing. On January 2nd, 1956, they organized a casual hangout, a standard outing that wouldn't raise a single red flag. No one realized this would be their final breathing moment on Earth. Their night kicked off, just like any typical teenage rendezvous. Around 9 o'clock, witnesses spotted them at Pete's Drive-In, a local greasy spoon where kids grabbed burgers and wasted hours. Giggling and totally at ease, not a single diner patron noticed anything suspicious hiding in the shadows. Just a blissful pair soaking up the diner's heat, completely oblivious to the freezing abyss waiting outside the glass. Shortly past 9, they finally vanished. Cruising west down Central Avenue, they headed for Wadsworth Park, an infamous local hangout, a secluded lover's lane where teenagers parked in the pitch black, blasting tunes and tuning out reality. An innocent, completely mundane ritual. But hours later, it transformed into a brutal death trap for Lloyd and Patty. The horrifying events along the Sun River that starless night left no witnesses, burying a macabre secret for 65 agonizing years. January 3rd dawned bleak and freezing, typical for a harsh Montana winter. The Sun River snaked sluggishly across the terrain, a black vein through the snow. Wadsworth Park sat eerily dead, wrapped in that suffocating dawn silence before the city woke. 3 local kids were trekking down the shoreline. Exploring that area was completely standard behavior. They knew the paths well, bracing against the sharp, exhilarating frostbite of the morning air. Strolling without a care, they weren't hunting for trouble, until they spotted the abandoned vehicle, idling off a gravel path in a notorious makeout spot. They almost ignored it, but a sickening gut feeling forced them to stop and stare. Headlights blaring, engine still humming, and sprawled face first in the dirt nearby. To lay a teenage boy. Someone had brutally bound his wrists behind his back using his own leather belt. Panic set in. The kids bolted immediately. Barely an hour later, Cascade County deputies swarmed the gruesome perimeter. Detectives quickly tagged the victim, 18-year-old airman Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. 2 slugs fired execution-style directly into the back of his skull. A calculated hit meant to guarantee death. 0 chance of survival. Just a swift, merciless slaughter in the dark, the kind of flawless execution that makes you wonder who was really pulling the strings. Detectives immediately secured the perimeter, treating the chilling tableau with absolute surgical precision. The grim discoveries made during those initial moments would haunt local law enforcement for generations. The engine was still idling. High beams pierced the darkness, and a local broadcast crackled from the dash, freezing the gruesome moment in time. The motive clearly wasn't financial. Cash remained stashed in the dashboard, while a pricey camera sat completely undisturbed on the upholstery. The phantom who orchestrated this bloodbath didn't care about a payday. A botched mugging was completely off the table. Meanwhile, Patricia had vanished without a single trace. Authorities delivered the gut-wrenching updates as the sun came up. Word bled through the tight-knit community like venom, infecting every household with paralyzing fear before breakfast. Relatives down in Texas received the devastating call from 1,000 miles away. Patrolmen delivered the nightmare directly to Patricia's parents on the southwest side of town. A flickering, desperate optimism survived for a fleeting moment. The young woman was simply gone, swallowed entirely by the dark. Without a body, human nature clings to comforting delusions. Maybe she escaped the vehicle. Maybe she sprinted into the woods. Maybe she was shivering in a ditch somewhere, terrified but breathing. That fantasy shattered in under 24 hours. The following day, January 4th, a local maintenance crew rolled down Vineyard Road. Navigating the rugged, winding gravel trails just north of Great Falls, the driver barely spotted the anomaly. The missing teenager lay discarded at the base of a 20-foot ravine, tossed into a steep, rugged hollow. She suffered a fatal bullet wound to the skull, mirroring her boyfriend's execution. Yet the cruelty ran much deeper. Post-mortem imagery eventually exposed horrifying truths that the local precinct tried to keep buried. Massive contusions indicated a ferocious fight for survival, followed by horrifying proof of sexual violence prior to the execution. A massive 5-mile gap separated the two gruesome crime scenes. 5 miles completely apart. The killer practically guaranteed the victims would remain separated in death, executing a sinister blueprint. It was a calculated, chillingly systematic operation that proved this was no random crime of passion. A massive manhunt launched into high gear that very afternoon. Yet an unsettling shadow hung over the evidence, a dark puzzle that Cascade County officials would chase for 60 years. Law enforcement threw absolute maximum resources at the mystery throughout the following week. Detectives grilled bystanders and squeezed every soul who crossed paths with the couple that fatal night. Diner employees, close buddies, locals, and anyone hovering near Pete's Drive-In went straight into the interrogation room. Techs scoured both bloodbaths for trace materials, while search teams continuously combed through Wadsworth Park. Deputies marched along the asphalt connecting the grave sites, desperate for a stray boot print, torn fabric, or discarded brass that could unmask the monster. 35 potential culprits eventually landed on the radar. 35 distinct targets, each meticulously tracked, fiercely interrogated, and systematically cleared. The shortlist featured a fellow military man from Malmstrom Air Force Base packing a notorious violent streak. They also looked hard at Edward Wayne Edwards, a drifter busted for local break-ins that year, who eventually became a serial predator stalking secluded parking spots across the Midwest. Another wild card named Wendell Wallace Smith actually bragged to the press about slaughtering 2 teenagers up in Big Sky country. That admission proved totally bogus. However, the real mastermind's identity remained buried under 65 years of dust. Back in 1956, this ghost didn't exist anywhere in the official files. A twist will unravel soon. For now, the police had nothing but dead ends. Both kill sites offered absolutely zero actionable clues. The barren, frozen landscape had been battered by harsh elements before anyone discovered the carnage, washing away critical prints. Tangible forensics were practically non-existent. Decades before genetic mapping, digital profiling, or modern laboratory miracles could blow the mystery wide open, the manhunt slammed into a brick wall. Down south, Lloyd's relatives buckled under the agonizing uncertainty. His sibling Dwayne internalized the immense sorrow, locking the trauma away, like most men from that era, silent on the outside, tormented on the inside. Decades down the line, Dwayne's widow admitted the tragedy fundamentally broke him. The deafening void of justice slowly ate away at his soul. Patricia's loved ones faced the exact same living hell. A phantom killer stole her sister's future, while creeping dementia eventually wiped her own memories of that tragic era. The burials, The endless interrogations, those agonizing midnight hours imagining her sister's brutal final moments. Then, the investigation just froze over silently. Exactly how these mysteries fade. No grand press conference ever happened, just a creeping, suffocating silence as public interest vanished. Dossiers got shoved into cardboard. Physical proof was locked away in the dark. Great Falls turned a blind eye, like any community terrified of its own shadows. Yet the clues remained perfectly preserved, biding their time. We pour weeks into investigating these shadows, spending sleepless nights tearing through dusty archives to resurrect buried nightmares. We do it because these victims count, and their stolen futures demand absolute justice. If you need us to continue exposing the sinister truths behind these cover-ups, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment about which chilling detail messed with your head the most. Check the description for more unsolved horrors. Let us dive back into the abyss. For 45 long years, the Kalitska-Bogle mystery existed in absolute purgatory. People whispered about it. Residents around Great Falls passed down the grim legend, the way tight-knit communities obsess over unresolved tragedies. Yet nobody was actually hunting the killer. Zero fresh tips surfaced, witnesses vanished, and forensic science was completely stalled. Those tragic dossiers collected dust deep inside the Cascade County Sheriff's vault, untouched for decades, right up until 1988. That exact year, an investigator going by the name Phil Madison took a post down in that very records bunker. He was never officially handed this investigation. He never went hunting for it. Yet, surrounded by the heavy aura of dead-end files and forgotten boxes, certain dark secrets demand attention. The Kalitska-Bogle folder screamed his name. Madison tore into the physical proof with an entirely new perspective, and what he unearthed, hidden deep inside a standard 1956 medical examiner report, transformed into the holy grail of this entire nightmare. While conducting Patricia Kalitski's autopsy, the medical examiner followed standard protocol by securing an intimate biological sample. That critical trace material was meticulously safeguarded, locked flawlessly onto a tiny piece of lab glass. It hibernated inside a cardboard container for more than 30 years, completely ignored by subsequent investigators. Yet, it waited. And smeared across that glass, if a detective possessed the guts to look closer, rested biological material that definitely excluded Lloyd Dwayne Bogle. By 2001, Madison finally shipped that crucial specimen off to the Montana State Forensic Facility. The findings returned with a horrifyingly crystal-clear truth. The microscopic trace evidence pulled from Patricia's remains completely ruled out her boyfriend. A phantom stalker shared the dark with them. A monster violated her. Now, after 45 agonizing years, this blind hunt gained a compass. Having a compass, however, is a hell of a lot different than actually catching the devil. They fed the genetic sequence sourced from that solitary cell straight into CODIS, the Federal Offender Network, only to hit a massive brick wall. Technicians ran it against the genetic markers of every single shadow figure authorities had eyeballed over the eras. Even Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mob boss operating out of Great Falls during the early 1950s, who caught a local assault charge in 1951. Bulger's sequence struck out. Edwards was a dead end too. Every single felon in the registry failed to match. So, the genetic ghost just sat there, lurking in the shadows once more. Upon hanging up his badge, Madison confessed a haunting truth to his team, carrying the heavy burden of a cop defeated by an impossible riddle. He admitted he felt the mystery would forever stay buried. Too many brilliant minds took a swing at this phantom, he confessed, and every single one of us failed to drag the truth into the light. He was dead wrong, though he would not stick around to witness the twist. The ultimate revelation never stemmed from a snitch. No guilty conscience ever cracked. It bypassed every single one of the 35 individuals interrogated and dismissed across 60 agonizing years of police work. It emerged from science fiction methods that were unimaginable back when Lloyd Bogle was executed from behind on that desolate makeout spot in January 1956. It derived from a newly forged investigative weapon. A tactic battle-tested during one of the most high-profile manhunts in the history of the United States. Back in 2018, authorities out in California slapped cuffs on a shadow named Joseph James D'Angelo. He was the phantom Golden State Killer, the monster who took 13 lives and brutalized almost 50 victims coast to coast through the 1970s and 80s. They trapped him using genetic ancestry tracking, an advanced tactic that ripped biological evidence straight from the crime scenes, fed it into civilian DNA networks, and mapped out entire bloodlines, hunting up and down the family branches until the monster finally had a face. It was an absolute paradigm shift, flipping the entire investigative world on its head. By 2012, a determined cop named John Cadner caught the Kalitsky-Bogle file at the Cascade County Precinct. This guy was literally younger than the mystery itself, brought into the world long after the blood had dried on that frozen ground. Yet staring into those archives, locking eyes with snapshots of two innocent kids who drove into the dark and met the devil, a fire ignited in his gut demanding justice. What if one microscopic drop held a town's darkest secret? Cadner bet everything on genetic evidence and hit the jackpot. By 2019, he partnered with Bode Technology, an elite Virginia laboratory renowned for cracking impossible forensic mysteries. Their starting point was a solitary sperm cell trapped under glass, guarding its grim truth for over 60 years. Scientists isolated an entirely fresh, comprehensive genetic signature, one primed to be fed into modern databases to hunt a ghost. The moment they hit search, the system spit out an unprecedented result, a familial link tracing through generations, pointing directly to a phantom completely absent from police records. This individual resided barely a mile from Patricia's front door when the slaughter occurred. A local equestrian who frequently traveled the exact dirt paths where her corpse ultimately surfaced. His identity? Kenneth Gould. As detectives dug into his background, a chilling realization set in. This predator wasn't some random drifter passing through. He was a shadow hiding in plain sight. Kenneth Gould avoided the spotlight entirely, leaving almost zero footprint. Officially, he possessed a pristine record. 0 mugshots, 0 convictions, and absolutely 0 documented violent tendencies. He existed under the radar as a solitary horse handler, blending seamlessly into the isolated fabric of rural Montana life. Completely forgettable and invisible, which made him the perfect threat. Back in 1956, Gould was a 29-year-old family man, raising children mere blocks from the exact neighborhood where Patricia spent her childhood. He wasn't separated by a long commute or city limits. A short walk away, easily within striking distance to watch her stroll home after classes or bump shoulders on the sidewalk. Intimately close enough to track her movements, memorize her hangouts, and study her routines. Plus, he mastered the local terrain. Locals frequently spotted him horseback riding, venturing far past city limits into deserted dirt paths and forgotten acres where ordinary folks rarely wandered without hidden agendas. This included Vineyard Road, the exact spot where Patricia was discarded down a 20-foot ravine 5 miles from her slain boyfriend. He patrolled those isolated woods constantly, committing every geographic detail to memory. The man understood precisely where blind corners hid, dropping cliffs, making it incredibly easy to vanish a human being unnoticed. Yet none of these red flags mattered in 1956. He slipped entirely under the radar. Not one mention in the entire dossier. Across 60 long years and 35 separate persons of interest, through countless interrogations and endless rabbit holes, Kenneth Gould remained a phantom. Not a single cop ever cast a suspicious glance his way. Authorities established absolutely 0 social overlap linking this phantom to either slain teenager, no shared acquaintances whatsoever. Without a clear psychological trigger, investigators couldn't pin down a reason for the slaughter. He lurked quietly in the narrative's dark margins, geographically adjacent, yet utterly invisible to law enforcement when it truly counted. Then, detectives unearthed an unsettling little anomaly, an isolated fact easily dismissed in passing, until they put his hidden past under a microscope. At age 25, he took a 16-year-old bride chillingly, the exact age Patricia was when a monster ended her life. Genetic sequencing supplied an identity, but pointing fingers at a deceased suspect doesn't legally seal a conviction. The prime suspect passed away in 2007 at 79 years old in rural Missouri, leaving only ashes behind. Without a corpse, pulling a direct forensic comparison to the 1956 crime scene evidence was physically impossible. The truth hinged entirely on his living relatives. Detective Sergeant John Cadner initiated that agonizing, highly sensitive conversation. His offspring resided far off in Missouri, blissfully ignorant of any horrors tied to Great Falls. Oblivious to their patriarch's potential dark side, they listened as Cadner delicately, yet directly, dropped a bombshell. He informed them their dad was the prime target in a 65-year-old sexual assault and double execution. The fallout was wildly unpredictable. You never know what happens when you knock and say, "Your father might be a butcher," the investigator reflected afterward. Surprisingly, they fully cooperated. 3 of his adult kids voluntarily handed over their genetic material for testing. When the laboratory sent back the findings, the science left zero room for debate. The swabs locked in an undeniable hereditary tie, directly matching the reproductive fluid extracted from the victim 65 years prior. Gould was definitively the man who defiled her. For law enforcement, securing this reality brought a bizarre, heavy closure far from a traditional admission of guilt. There would be no courtroom theatrics, no televised sentencing, none of the satisfying Hollywood conclusions you expect from a brutal thriller. It ended in chilling silence, just a sterile diagnostic report and digital digits confirming a nightmare they couldn't unsee. The killer's own flesh and blood delivered a chilling realization, a haunting truth that left the lead detective completely paralyzed. Staring him dead in the eye, stripping away any trace of outrage or disbelief, she uttered a phrase, ripped straight from a psychological thriller. "You never truly know the dark secrets people hide." Only, this was chillingly real. An actual daughter coming to grips with the absolute monster who raised her. Armed with undeniable genetic proof, authorities meticulously mapped out the phantom footsteps of Kenneth Gould, tracking his shadowy existence long past the blood-soaked night of January 2nd, 1956. The horrifying portrait they uncovered was enough to make your blood run absolutely cold. Barely 4 weeks post-slaughter, while detectives were still scrambling, the suspect suddenly liquidated his Great Falls estate, dragging his oblivious family southeast to tiny Tracy. Come July, they vanished again, pushing even deeper into the isolated outskirts of Geraldine. Next came Hamilton, until 1967 when he finally fled Montana altogether, burying his past in Alton, Missouri. He completely ghosted his former life. 0 visits, 0 family reunions, 0 trace. The killer slashed his ties to the region with the desperate precision of a man escaping a deadly snare. Slipping into the shadows without a backward glance, investigators unearthed another terrifying anomaly. His criminal footprint vanished, entirely post-carnage. Not a single Missouri arrest, not one suspicious noise violation, nothing to trigger police radar. Detectives desperately hunted for matching cold case butcheries across his entire residential timeline, scouring decades of records, yet uncovering absolute agonizing silence. Did this psychopath genuinely retire his blade, or did he just perfect the art of hiding the bodies? We will never truly know. Other seemingly minor breadcrumbs were meticulously archived as the final chapter closed. Back in 1983, 33 years post-massacre, desperate cops leveled a massive 150-year-old cottonwood near the male victim's corpse for one grim purpose. They were praying to dig out the fatal, rusted slug buried deep within its bark. Following decades of intense debate, the top brass greenlit the operation, successfully extracting actual lead from the timber. Yet lacking the murder weapon, it was another dead end. Generations of fresh investigators inherited the nightmare, fueled by a relentless obsession. Staring at the same gruesome crime scene photos, pacing the identical dirt paths, drowning in the exact same maddening dead ends. They could practically feel the ghost of the killer taunting them from the shadows. Yet the mystery refused to crack. Until science finally shattered the quiet. On June 8, 2021, local law enforcement faced the flashing cameras. It wasn't some massive spectacle. It was a painfully solemn gathering, thick with an overwhelming atmosphere of exhausted closure and lingering trauma. 65 grueling years of unanswered agony instantly boiling down to a single microphone check. The lead investigator stepped up to the podium, finally dropping the bombshell revelation everyone had been craving. He named their phantom. Kenneth Gould was the definitive monster who butchered the young couple, backed by irrefutable genetic proof. The ancestral bloodline linked perfectly, officially slamming the book on one of America's most ancient, notorious genealogical manhunts. Case closed. Yet the reigning sheriff delivered a heavily caveat-laced statement, emphasizing the killer's suspect status. Because the executioner was already rotting in his grave alongside crucial witnesses, legal guilt could never be formally stamped by a jury. "This bitter pill is the closest thing to justice we'll ever swallow," he admitted with brutal, unflinching honesty. Yet it leaves a sickening taste in your mouth, exposing a dark reality that seasoned true crime junkies understand all too well. Some twisted mysteries reward us with handcuffs, while others merely hand over a cold, sterile explanation. This nightmare hovered in purgatory. Detectives ultimately pieced together a chillingly calculated sequence of the final moments. That freezing January 2nd, 1956, the doomed teens parked at a notoriously secluded lover's lane near Wadsworth Park, a classic local hangout, until a shadow emerged from the pitch black. The boy was violently ambushed and subdued, viciously bound with his very own leather belt, before catching a fatal round directly to the skull. He bled out in the frozen Montana dirt. But the girl? She was abducted into the horrific unknown, spared execution at the initial site. Dragged 5 agonizing miles away to Vineyard Road, she endured unspeakable violations before finally being executed. That brutal geographic gap screams pure, terrifying premeditation. This predator was operating on a strictly sinister, calculated blueprint. This wasn't some explosive crime of passion, but the work of a cold-blooded tactician who went on to live a remarkably mundane existence, hiding out less than a single mile from the very neighborhood where his victim had spent her innocent childhood. He literally trotted his horses down their streets, breathing their air, blending flawlessly into the grieving family's universe as the ultimate undetected predator. Was the killer always watching? For the surviving kin, the official news felt chillingly complex. Hardly closure. True closure is virtually impossible after 65 years of agonizing silence. But they finally got the next best thing, a definitive identity, a clear target after decades lost in darkness. Lloyd's sibling, Dwayne, passed away in 2013, 8 brutal years before detectives cracked it. His widow confessed to Detective Cadner that the agonizing mystery quietly consumed Dwayne until his very last breath. Like most tough guys back then, he buried the trauma. That dark shadow haunted his entire existence, she revealed. He went to his grave completely blind to his brother's fate. But his surviving bloodline eventually learned the chilling truth, shifting everything. Patricia's sister managed to outlive the cold case, though severe cognitive decline had already stolen her mind for years. The grim evidence, the killer's identity, the genetic match, none of it registered through her dementia anymore. Yet, her sharp-minded family absorbed every detail. They finally knew. Music. The manhunt ended. The grim archives locked. Kenneth Gold was ashes untouchable by any judge or jury. He successfully dragged his sinister 51-year secret straight into the dirt. From that freezing January slaughter of 2 teens in Great Falls, until his final breath in Missouri, he built a seemingly perfect American dream, right on top of a double homicide. Nobody suspected a damn thing. His spouse, his kids, everyone remained oblivious for decades. It took one microscopic biological trace, frozen on a glass slide for 65 years, to completely shatter his illusion. Following the bombshell press conference, Cadner chewed on the massive psychological toll this manhunt took, both on the bloodlines and multiple generations of haunted investigators. Music. Those old-school cops bled for this investigation, he admitted, tipping his hat to the relentless detectives who hunted ghosts before him. It hits hard, seeing that obsessive grind, music, and realizing they were standing right on the razor's edge of the truth without even seeing it. The smoking gun was hiding in plain sight, a forgotten swab, a dusty glass slide, one microscopic cell holding everything. It just rotted away inside a damp precinct basement vault for decades, biding its time until forensic science evolved enough to catch a predator. When the lab finally cracked it, the grim reality aligned perfectly with their darkest theories. Ultimately, there was no grand, elaborate phantom. Music, no shadowy conspiracy or brilliant criminal mastermind, just an ordinary, chillingly normal guy. A totally forgettable local living just down the road. A guy who casually rode his horses through town, flashed friendly smiles, and slept soundly harboring a sickening darkness that absolutely nobody, not the folks next door, not his own blood, and certainly not 65 years of seasoned detectives ever saw coming. Right as the files slammed shut, Detective Cadner dropped a chilling observation that haunted everyone listening. A journalist pressed him on the lone wolf theory, asking if Gould orchestrated the bloodbath entirely solo, or if some shadowy accomplice was pulling strings in the background. The investigator paused. Finally, he answered, "Look, I physically can't place the murder weapon in his grip today, but analyzing the entire puzzle, he's absolutely our guy. Utter certainty, yet completely lacking that crucial smoking gun." Zero courtroom drama. No dramatic confession, no grand moment of accountability where a monster stares down the shattered families and finally pays for his horrifying sins. That crucial catharsis was permanently stolen. Gone forever. Still, Lloyd and Patricia, just two innocent kids grabbing burgers at Pete's Drive-In on a freezing January night in 1956, heading toward Lover's Lane with their entire futures ahead of them. Their memory refuses to fade away. Their brutal tragedy has officially been yanked out of those dusty precinct catacombs. And the ruthless predator who stole their futures? The guy who casually trotted down Vineyard Road, liquidated his assets, fled across state lines, and played house for 51 years like that slaughter never occurred? That phantom finally has a face. Kenneth Gould. And 65 agonizing years later, Great Falls finally realizes exactly what he... The tragic 1956 execution of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky serves as a haunting testament to the fact that justice, though sometimes delayed by generations, is ultimately relentless. Their story offers a profound lesson on the illusory nature of safety and the persistence of truth. For 65 years, a monster named Kenneth Gould lived a remarkably mundane life, hiding in plain sight mere blocks from his victims' homes. He trotted his horses down the very streets where Patricia grew up, blending flawlessly into a grieving community while harboring a sickening, blood-soaked secret. The most chilling educational takeaway is that evil often wears a familiar, forgettable face. Gould wasn't a shadowy criminal mastermind. He was a trusted neighbor with a pristine record who liquidated his life and vanished across state lines just weeks after the slaughter. His story is a stark warning. Ignoring a predator's geographic proximity or normalcy does not make the threat any less lethal. Ultimately, this case is a victory for forensic perseverance. It reminds us that every microscopic cell matters. A solitary biological trace, frozen on a glass slide for over 6 decades, eventually shattered a 51-year-old lie. We must honor Lloyd and Patricia by remaining vigilant, demanding accountability, and believing that no matter how deep a secret is buried, the light of science will eventually find it